The snow went still before she heard anything. That was the first sign. In 5 years of northern winters, Kaya Drennan had learned to read the wilderness the way she read her field journals, every detail a sentence, every silence a paragraph. And this silence had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the cabin walls and sat in the gaps between the fire's crackle and Silt's breathing. The old mutt lay stretched across the hearthrug, and in the middle of his exhale he stopped. Just stopped. His gray muzzle came up, ears swiveled, and the muscles of his back legs went tight as drawn wire. Kaya set down her mortar. She had been grinding preserved sylviroot, a task that required no thought and therefore suited the hour, close to midnight. Fire burned low, the wind outside doing its usual work against the wooden shutters. She was good at occupying her hands while the rest of her went quiet. She had made a practice of it. She had made a practice of many things in 5 years. Solitude, self-sufficiency, the particular art of wanting nothing she could not provide for herself. She reached for the knife at her belt without looking at it. The window was right there, 3 steps. She took them without making a sound, pressed her back to the wall beside the frame, and looked. They came out of the tree line the way water comes out of dark ground, inevitable, already there before you notice them. 10 wolves, not rogue, not scattered. They moved in formation with the quiet discipline of animals that had been trained by someone who understood war, spreading wide in a loose arc that covered every angle of the clearing. Their eyes caught the moonlight and gave it back in gold. And behind them, interrupting the scale of the trees themselves, a man. He stopped at the foot of her porch steps. He was enormous, not merely tall but built like something the North had assembled over a long winter, broad through the chest and shoulders, his dark coat dusted white at the collar from the snow still falling. He carried no weapon she could see. He stood in her snowstorm without any particular urgency, looked up at the window where she was watching him from the dark, and then, deliberately, unhurriedly, he knocked. 3 times. On the door of a cabin the rest of the world had forgotten existed. Silt put his head back down on the hearthrug. Kaya stared at the most powerful alpha in the North, standing in her snow, and said nothing for a very long time. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The Journal. You have 10 wolves, she said through the door. That is not a trade, that is a threat. The wolves are for the road. His voice carried easily through the wood, deep, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never once had to raise it to be heard. I came to your door alone. Kaya did not open the door. She stood with her back to it, knife in her left hand, listening to the quality of the silence outside. She had learned in 5 years of living alone in the Grayville wilderness that silence had texture. This one was steady, patient, not the coiled readiness of something about to spring, not the brittle, careful quiet of a lie preparing itself. Whatever was standing on her porch, it was telling her the truth about waiting. That did not mean she had to trust it. What do you want? She said. A pause, as if he were considering exactly how much truth was required. I have something that belongs to you, he said, and I need something you have made. I would like to discuss a trade. You could have sent a letter. I didn't know your name until 6 days ago. That gave her pause. She turned it over, examining it the way she examined unfamiliar plant matter, looking for the shape of the thing, the edges that would tell her what it was. If he hadn't known her name, he'd known something else about her. Enough to find a cabin that did not appear on any map she hadn't drawn herself. How did you find this place? She said. A trader, Western Markets. He sold something to one of my people that had your handwriting in it. Another pause, shorter. May I come in, Kaya Drennan? The snow is not a hardship, but the conversation will be easier without the door between us. She looked at Silt. Silt was asleep again, which was either the worst or the most comforting possible indicator. She had found him half dead in her second winter here, dragged him back to the cabin, fed him bark broth through a folded leaf when he couldn't lift his head. He had terrible instincts about most things but an uncanny ability to decide correctly when something was not worth worrying about. He had gone rigid at the wolves. He had relaxed the moment the man knocked. Kaya opened the door. He had to duck to get through the frame, which struck her as information. The cabin was not a small building. She had extended it herself in her 3rd year, added the workroom and the drying loft and the reinforced storage alcove. The main room had an 8-foot ceiling. His head cleared it by perhaps 2 inches. He stopped inside the threshold, looked at the room, the shelves of labeled jars, the drying racks hung with winter herbs, the stacked field journals on the table, the mortar she had abandoned, the fire, and then looked at her. He was older than she had expected. Not old, but not young either, somewhere in that particular landscape of a man who had been doing hard things for long enough that the evidence of it lived in his face. Dark hair, a short beard gone slightly silver at the jaw, a scar on the bridge of his nose, thin and old. His eyes were the particular gray of the sky before a serious storm, and they were, she noted immediately, already finished taking inventory of the room and entirely focused on her. He was the Alpha King of the Thornwood Alliance. She knew him by description only, Rowan Asheville, commander of the most feared pack coalition in the Northern Territories, a man who had fought 3 territorial wars in 15 years and ended all 3 of them on his own terms. She had heard of him the way exiles hear of things. Through traders, through overheard conversations in the market settlements she visited twice a year for supplies, through the occasional traveler who wandered too far north and needed directions. She had not heard of him as the kind of man who knocked. He set the item he was carrying on her table without being invited to. A journal, dark leather cover, worn at the corners, the spine cracked from use. Kaya looked at it from across the room and felt the recognition before she had consciously processed it. The exact brown of that particular leather, the specific way the cover had warped slightly in the upper right corner, where it had spent a winter near a fire with insufficient waterproofing. She crossed the room in 4 steps, stopped herself from reaching for it, and looked at him instead. "Where did you get that?" "A trader from the Western markets sold it to an intelligence contact of mine 8 months ago." He remained still, making no move that she hadn't initiated. She noticed that too. "My healers have been working from the compound research inside. They got close, but a key step is missing from the sequence, and 3 other notation systems in the later pages reference information that doesn't appear anywhere in the journal itself. They've been working blind for 6 months." "Working blind on what?" "A cure." He looked at her directly. "There is a plague spreading through the southern packs. It presents as a respiratory illness, attacks the bonding channels in shifted wolves, and leaves them unable to heal. My healers have never seen anything like it. No one has, until the formula in this journal indicated that someone had documented a very similar toxic compound 3 years before the first outbreak." Kaya reached out and picked up the journal. She knew it in her hands the moment she touched it. The weight of it, the particular thickness of the pages. She had used the heavier pressed paper for fieldwork journals because it handled moisture better, and she had bought a full ream of it from a papermaker in Asheville the winter she turned 19, before everything. She had carried that ream north with her when she left, used it through her first 3 field notebooks, run out in her 4th year, and never found the same weight again. 3rd field notebook. This was the 3rd one. She had thought it was lost, had turned the cabin over twice looking for it after her 2nd winter, assumed it had gone into the river with a pack she'd dropped during the spring thaw. She had rewritten everything she could remember from it into the 4th journal and considered it gone. She opened the cover. The inside page was blank except for one thing, pressed flat against the paper and still, impossibly, holding its color, a spike bloom. Pale amber petals, the distinctive star-shaped center. A flower that grew only in the highland meadows of the Asheville territory, her home, in the specific microclimate created by the mountain shadow and the particular mineral content of the Asheville soil. She had looked for it in Grayville for 2 years before accepting it would not grow here. She had brought seeds north out of something she had refused to call sentimentality at the time, planted them in a protected corner of her garden in the first spring, and watched them fail season after season until the 3rd year, when one of them put out a single bloom in late summer that lasted 11 days. She had pressed the first flower the morning it opened. She stood with her hand flat on the open journal and did not look up for a long time. "How do you know I am the author?" she said, when she had herself under sufficient control. He didn't answer immediately. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, not sympathy exactly, not calculation, something more careful than either. "The flower," he said. "My archivist identified it, native exclusively to the Asheville Highland Meadows, minimum 2-day journey from your current location. Someone brought it here deliberately, and the research inside uses notation systems and plant name variants specific to Asheville Highland herbalism. My healers consulted 3 different regional scholars before they understood what they were reading." A pause. "But I knew before the archivist told me. The handwriting." He glanced at her work table, at the notation she had been making in her current journal when he knocked. Same hand. She looked down at the journal again, turned to the first real entry. Her own handwriting, 19 years old and slightly more cramped than it was now, she had learned to write larger once she was out here, found the cramped notation she'd been trained into was actually harder to read in low firelight. She could see the exact page where she'd started to adjust, the slow shift in the letters across the winter. She turned to page 41. A compound entry. 8 pages of dense notation, diagrams, the pressed specimen she had found on the drowned River Reed, the toxicological testing she had done on herself, careful, microdosed, rigorously documented, to verify the compound's effects. She had been meticulous about it, the way she was meticulous about everything, because she had learned early that the wilderness did not give second chances to people who guessed. She read the entry in full. Then she closed the journal and set it back on the table and looked at Rowan Asheville. "What exactly do you want from me?" she said. "Come south," he said. "Complete the formula publicly with proper attribution. Present your findings to the Thornwood Assembly so the cure cannot be suppressed or rerouted. Tell them where the research originated and who authored it. And in exchange, safe passage, my personal guarantee that no one in Asheville touches you while you are under my protection." He held her gaze steadily. "And when it is done, whatever you want, title, land, financial compensation, full anonymity, your choice without condition." Kaya looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 5 years developing a very accurate sense of when she was being lied to, the kind of sense you built not from cynicism, but from necessity, from being the only person available to catch a lie before it cost you something important. She read him the way she read the land, looking for the thing that didn't match, the detail that interrupted E pattern. She didn't find it, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if she had. "You are missing more than one step," she said. He studied her. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the controlled precursor to one, the expression of a man who had been expecting to negotiate and found himself briefly disarmed instead. "I know," he said. Kaya looked at the journal, at the spike bloom on the inside cover, amber and impossible and entirely hers. She thought about what it meant that her third field notebook had ended up in the Western markets. She thought about the plague, about people dying of something she had documented at 19 with obsessive care, about a cure that was close but incomplete because someone had taken the book without understanding everything inside it. She thought about the fact that she had spent 5 years becoming the most knowledgeable plant healer in 3 kingdoms, and the only witness to that fact was a battered old mutt currently snoring by the fire. "Sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." He sat. He folded himself into the chair across from her table with the particular economy of movement of a very large man who had learned to exist in spaces built for smaller people, and he settled, and he waited, not with the impatience of someone who was used to being deferred to, with the specific quality of attention of someone who understood that the next conversation was more important than the last 10 years of his life. Kaya pulled her current journal toward her and opened it to a clean page. "The missing step in the sequence is not a missing step," she said. "It is a variable. The compound behaves differently depending on the mineral content of the water source it is grown in. There is no single step because there is no single compound. There are 6 variants, and the correct preparation differs for each." She began to write without looking up. "Your healers have probably been working from the Highland River variant, which is the most common in the documented range. If the plague is affecting the southern packs, they are almost certainly dealing with the lowland sediment variant, which requires a different catalyst compound and a longer reduction time." She heard him shift in the chair. Not restlessly, she was already learning to read him, she realized, which was its own kind of irritation. He had shifted forward, the way people did when they were paying close attention and their bodies expressed it before they thought to control it. "How long have you known this?" he said. "I documented the variant differentiation in my 5th journal." She turned and found the 5th journal on the shelf without looking. She kept them in order always, the same system she had used since the beginning. She laid it open beside the 3rd notebook, found the relevant entry, slid it toward him. "Page 27 through 33, written 4 years ago." He looked at the entry, then at her. "This is complete," she said. "Your healers were working from an incomplete source because the 3rd journal is incomplete. Everything you need is in journals 3 through 7 in sequence. They cannot be used independently." A long silence. Outside, the snow continued its business against the shutters. One of the wolves made a sound, low, not urgent, and another answered it. Kaya did not look toward the window. "Kaya Drennan," Rowan said. His voice had a different quality to it now, something she could not immediately name. Not reverence exactly. Something more practical than that and somehow more serious. The cure has been sitting in a cabin in the Grayville wilderness for 4 years. Yes. And no one knew. She looked at him steadily. I told no one. There was no one to tell. He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable and settled into something she would have called reckoning if she had been in a more poetic frame of mind. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing something permanently and irrevocably. I need you to come south, he said. I need you to do this publicly, and I need the attribution correct. There are reasons I cannot explain yet that make both of those things essential, but I am asking you to trust me far enough to leave this cabin and walk back into the world that, he stopped, started again. Back into a world you have good reasons to avoid, and I will not pretend I am unaware of what that costs. Kaya looked at the spike bloom pressed against the inside cover of her stolen journal. She thought about the winter she was 19, sitting in the snow 3 miles north of Ashevin with one bag and a ream of heavy paper and seeds she hadn't known why she was saving. She thought about the entry she had written that night. I am going to learn everything this land knows, and I am never going to apologize for knowing it. She had kept that promise. She simply had not anticipated the moment when keeping it would require her to walk back toward the thing she had walked away from. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. She told him 4. He agreed to all 4 without negotiating a single one, without a pause, without a counteroffer, without the slight tightening around the eyes that indicated someone accepting worse terms than they wanted. He simply said yes, and then waited. It was the most unsettling thing he had done yet. She closed both journals, stacked them on top of the third, looked at the row of field notebooks on the shelf, 7 of them, 4 years of documented wilderness knowledge, the most complete record of highland and northern medicinal botany that existed anywhere. Give me an hour, she said. He stood that same careful economy of movement and moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. The wolves won't come to the cabin, he said. They know better, and the one nearest the woodpile answers to Slate. He will not bother you, but if you want him moved, say his name first. Then he went out into the snow, and the door closed behind him. Kaya stood alone in her cabin for a moment. The fire crackled. Silt wheezed in his sleep and his back leg twitched once. She looked at the stolen journal on her table, at the spike bloom inside its cover, at the row of notebooks on the shelf that contained 5 years of work no one had ever read. Then she went to pack. Chapter 2. What she buried. She gave herself the hour she had asked for, and she used it precisely. First the journals, all 7 of them, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with the double-cord method she had developed in her second winter after losing a pack to a river crossing. Then her full field kit, bone-handled knife, collapsible drying frame, the small brass mortar that had belonged to her grandmother and survived the exile wrapped in a sock at the bottom of her original bag. Her dried stock of the most critical compounds, the ones that could not be sourced quickly in the south, mountain ashwort, deeproot, the powdered bark of the northern gray birch that grew only above the snowline. Her 3 remaining spike bloom seeds in their paper envelope, just in case. Practical, sequential. She did not allow herself to think about what she was doing until she was already doing it, because she knew herself well enough to know that if she allowed the thinking to get ahead of the doing would not happen at all. She was almost finished when she sat down on the edge of her bed, and the thinking caught up with her anyway. The bonding ceremony had been in late autumn. She remembered the particular cold of it, not the bitter deep winter cold that she had learned to live inside, but the early cold, the first real cold of the season, the kind that caught you unprepared because summer had only just released its grip. She remembered the fire in the clearing, the way it lit the faces of the assembled pack from below and made everyone look ceremonial, significant, like participants in something that would be recorded. She had been prepared. Of course she had been prepared. She had been preparing for the bonding ceremony for 2 years, the way every young wolf prepared, the anticipation of it a constant low hum beneath everything else. She had worn her good wool. Her hair was down. She had spent the previous night going over the things she would say when it happened, the formal responses, the ritual acknowledgement, because she had always been careful about words and she wanted to do it correctly. Caden Moore had looked at her for perhaps 4 seconds. She could still reconstruct those 4 seconds with architectural precision, the way his gaze traveled across her, the small tightening at the corner of his mouth that she had not understood in the moment but had spent the following years understanding completely. He was not surprised. That was the detail she kept returning to, the one that had taken her the longest to see. He was not surprised. He was confirming. checking a conclusion he had already reached. She presents nothing, he said, not to her, to the assembled pack, to the elders, to the fire and the cold and the careful faces of every person who had watched her grow up. No aura, no spark. She smells like the forest and nothing else. This is a defective Bond candidate. I won't take it. The crowd had gone quiet, not the quiet of shock, the quiet of people who had already decided what they were going to do with the information before it arrived. Her cousin had stepped forward from the edge of the circle, already dressed for it, already prepared. Kaya had not looked at her face. The formal severance was brief. It was designed to be brief. The ceremony did not linger on the parts that didn't work. Kaya had walked, not run. She had been very clear with herself about that, even in the moment. Running was a different kind of statement, and she had refused to make it. She had walked north, out of the firelight and into the dark between the trees, with one bag on her back and her field notes from the previous 2 years, and the ream of heavy paper she had bought that morning for a reason she no longer remembered. She had walked for 3 hours before she sat down. The snow had been new then, thin and uncertain on the ground, and she had found a flat stone beside the road and sat on it and looked at the dark. She was not crying. She had been very focused on that as well, not crying, because crying required accepting that something had been taken, and she was not yet ready to accept that. She was still in the part of the shock that felt like clarity. The cold, bright, airless clarity of a person who has just learned that a thing they had never questioned was, in fact, entirely untrue. She opened her field notebook to a clean page. She wrote, I am going to learn everything this land knows, and I am never going to apologize for knowing it. Then she had kept walking. 5 years. She did the arithmetic the way she did everything, precisely, without drama. 5 winters, 5 spring thaws, 412 entries across 7 field journals, 12 documented plant variants that did not appear in any regional herbalism record she had ever read, 3 entirely novel preparation methods for common compounds that she had arrived at through systematic error and retesting, 1 cure for a plague that had not yet existed when she began the research that would produce it, and 1 stolen journal, 3rd notebook. The winter of her 20th year, 3 months into her exile, when she had been hungry and cold, and making herself useful because making herself useful was the only frame she had found that kept the clarity from becoming something else. She sat with that for a moment. She had not thought, at any point in the 5 years, about what it meant that her 3rd journal was missing. She had rewritten the compound research from memory into her 4th notebook, accepted the loss as the kind of loss the North delivered routinely, and moved on. She had not thought about where it might have gone, because there was nothing between her cabin and the road except wilderness, and no one came through the wilderness because no one knew she was there. Except someone had known enough. Not her name. He had said he had not known her name until 6 days ago, but something. Enough to take the journal. Enough to put it in the hands of someone who would eventually sell it west. That meant someone had been to this cabin. Before it was properly a cabin. Before the extension. Before the drying loft. Before the garden took. In her first winter, when she had been 20 years old and building a life out of frozen ground and stubbornness, and the very particular anger of someone who has just been publicly told that they are nothing. Someone had come here and taken the notebook and said nothing. Left no sign, left no message, left her to assume she had lost it herself. Kaya stood up from the bed, picked up her packed satchel, put it over her shoulder and went to the door. Rowan Asheville was at the tree line, standing with his back to the cabin, watching the wolves settle into their nighttime positions. He turned when she stepped onto the porch, looked at her, at the satchel, at the 4 additional journals tucked under her arm, and said nothing. I have conditions, she said. He turned fully to face her. He had his arms at his sides, his weight evenly balanced, the posture of someone who was prepared for the conversation to go any direction. She named the 4 conditions. They came out in the order. She had organized them in her mind during the hour. No physical confrontations involving her body or her work were to be initiated by his people without her explicit prior consent. She retained custody of all original journals at all times. Her attribution was to be established in the formal record before any public presentation of the cure. And when the assembly proceedings were concluded, she retained the unconditional right to return north without obligation, expectation, or formal tie to any pack structure. He heard all 4, then he said, yes. No negotiation, no counter, no pause to indicate he was weighing one against another. She watched him for a moment, looking for the thing she had missed. You agreed without asking me what the conditions were, she said. I heard the conditions. I mean, you agreed before you knew what they were, before I opened my mouth. He looked at her steadily. The storm had lightened somewhat, the snow still falling but thinner now, less purposeful. In the partial dark, his face was composed, readable only as far as he allowed. You survived alone in the northern wilderness for 5 years without dying or asking for help, he said. Whatever conditions you named were going to be reasonable, and if they weren't, I was going to say so. You didn't say so. No. Kaya looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped off the porch, walked past him to the woodpile, and stopped in front of the wolf resting there, gray-coated, enormous, watching her with calm gold eyes. Slate, she said. The wolf's ears moved forward, attentive. You're in the way of the woodpile. Move 6 feet east. Slate stood, shook off the light snow on his coat and walked 6 feet east. Lay back down. Kaya looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up enough wood for the week, stacked it under the extended porch roof where it would stay dry, and went back inside to bank the fire for a long absence and leave Silt's food where he could reach it. Through the window, she could see Rowan standing exactly where she had left him, not moving, not following, not filling the silence with anything. She had spent 5 years making her world small enough that she could control every variable in it. She was about to walk it outside its edges for the first time since she'd built it. She picked up the Spikebloom journal from the table, tucked it under her arm with the others. Then she went back out into the snow. Chapter 3. The road south. They left before dawn. The wolves moved out first. Rowan gave a signal Kaya did not see so much as feel, a low-frequency shift in the air, and they spread into the trees in the same loose formation she had seen from the window, the ones she had watched emerge from the dark the previous night. She counted them in the gray pre-dawn as they passed. 10, as he had said, ranging in color from near black to a pale silver gray that made them difficult to see in snow, which she suspected was not accidental. She had been given a horse from his camp, a dark roan mare, compact and sure-footed, the kind of animal bred for mountain work rather than appearance. She noted that whoever had chosen it knew what they were doing. She also noted that her saddle packs had been loaded in exact correspondence to the list she had given Rowan's second-in-command at first light, a lean, quiet man named Harwick who wrote everything down and asked no unnecessary questions. She appreciated that. Rowan rode ahead of her on a horse that was, like its rider, built on a scale that suggested the Northern Territories had different ideas about proportion than everywhere else. They did not ride abreast immediately. He set a pace and let her take it, which she also noted. She catalogued everything. It was not a habit she had chosen, exactly. It had developed out of necessity in her first winter, when learning to read the landscape correctly had been the difference between finding the right route and a very similar-looking toxic one. She read the world by accumulating detail, sorting it into relevant and irrelevant, and building a working model from what remained. She did this with everything. The snow depth and the way the wind moved it between the trees. The wolf trails, which overlapped but never quite duplicated each other. Harwick's note-taking style, Rowan Asheville. He rode like the destination was already achieved. There was something in his posture that was not arrogance. She had seen arrogance, and it read differently, more effortful, needing acknowledgement to sustain itself. This was more like a man who had spent so long being the most capable person in most rooms that he had stopped needing to perform it. He looked at the road, at the trees, at the wolves' formation. He turned at intervals to look at her, not checking, more like confirming a calculation. She looked back steadily each time. He never appeared to expect otherwise. The first day was mostly silence. The mountain passes required attention. The snow was deep in the exposed sections, the footing treacherous on the descents, and the wind in the high gaps made conversation impractical. She was glad of it. She needed the space to think, and she thought better with her hands occupied and her eyes on the terrain. She thought about what it meant that her third journal had found its way to a Western market. She thought about the 6-month window between when her research would have had to leave the area and when the first plague cases were documented. According to the intelligence files, Rowan had summarized the previous night. She thought about the very specific detail that the journal had ended up sold rather than used directly, as if whoever took it had not understood what they had. Or as if they had wanted it to travel far enough that it could not be traced back. She was still thinking about it when they made camp on the first evening, in a sheltered hollow below the snowline where the wind dropped and the ground was dry enough to build a fire on. The wolves settled into an outer ring. Harwick produced food with the brisk competence of someone who had done this many hundreds of times. Rowan read. Not reports. A book, actual bound pages, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, which he held with the careful handling of something old. She noticed it and filed it and said nothing. "The compound on page 41, he said without looking up. "The mold on the drowned river reed. Your documentation notes 6 days of testing." "Yes." "On yourself?" "I did not have other test subjects available." He looked up at that. Something moved across his face that she could not immediately name. It was there for less than a second, and then it was contained, controlled, returned to the neutral expression he carried as a default. How long did the effects last? 11 days from first exposure. The respiratory involvement resolved by day 4. The joint effects persisted longer. She looked at him. "I documented the full recovery trajectory. It is in the entry." "I read it." He closed the book. "I am asking because the current outbreak cases are presenting with a significantly more severe version. The joint effects you documented as resolved by day 11 have been permanent in 7 cases. The respiratory involvement has been fatal in 4. Kaya looked at the fire. How long has the outbreak been active? 14 months. She ran through the implications in the order they presented. 14 months of active cases. The lowland variant of the compound, which she had documented as producing faster symptom onset and more aggressive systemic involvement. Used deliberately, meaning controlled dosing, controlled distribution, which would produce consistency in presentation. 4 fatalities. He has been dosing the water sources, she said. Rowan was very still. What makes you say that? The compound is not waterborne in its natural state. It presents in solid form on the plant matter, and it requires ingestion of the mold itself to produce toxicological effects. The concentrations in my test were from direct ingestion of the dried compound. To produce consistent infection across a pack population, you would need to introduce it into a shared water source in sufficient concentration. She looked at him. The lowland variant grows on specific river reeds. Someone with access to the correct location and the correct documentation of preparation methods could introduce it into a water source and produce exactly what you are describing. Page 41, Rowan said, and the preparation notes for the lowland variant in your 4th journal. Page 41 details the highland variant, she said, but the notation in the margins, entry 2, cross-references the lowland documentation. Anyone who knew how to read my notation system would find the lowland variant from page 41. She stopped. He didn't just steal the cure, she said. The fire moved in a brief draft. Somewhere in the outer ring of the camp, a wolf shifted in its sleep. He used my research to build the poison, she said. Her voice was even. She was concentrating very hard on keeping it even. He took my 3rd journal, which documented the compound's properties and my preparation method, and he used it to engineer an outbreak. Then he used the incomplete formula from the stolen journal to position his pack healers as the only ones who could treat it. He manufactured the plague, and he manufactured the cure, and he has been selling the treatment to the southern packs for 14 months. She looked at Rowan. That means he had the journal before the bonding ceremony, she said. Another silence, longer. In the dark beyond the fire, the wolves were breathing. Yes, Rowan said, quietly. The single word placed with the precision of someone who had decided the truth was owed, regardless of what it cost. Kaya looked at the fire for a long time. She had spent 5 years accepting the version of events that Cadden Moore had delivered to a crowd at a bonding ceremony, that she was nothing, that she was defective, that the rejection had been the natural conclusion of a natural insufficiency. She had built an entire life on the other side of that verdict. She had made something extraordinary on the other side of it. What she had not done, what she was only now understanding she had not done, was question the premise. She had never asked why a man who had never spoken 2 words to her had been so certain, so immediate, so prepared with the language of erasure. She had accepted the verdict the way you accepted weather, not because you agreed with it, but because it had the weight of something that simply was. He had the journal before the ceremony. He had known what was in it. He had known what she was becoming. And he had, before she even knew herself what she was capable of, decided to make sure no one else would know either. He was afraid of me, she said. It came out with a quality she hadn't intended, something too close to wonder. Rowan looked at her. Yes, he said, I think he was. Kaya was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her satchel, pulled out her current field journal, and opened it to a clean page. Tell me everything your intelligence people have on the water source locations, she said. I want to document the distribution pattern. If he has been operating for 14 months, the evidence of the dosing will still be present in the sediment around the affected sources. It won't just prove the compound was used, it will prove the mechanism. Rowan called Harwick over. Harwick produced the intelligence files with the same brisk efficiency he had produced dinner, and Kaya began to write, and the fire burned down, and the wolves slept, and outside the hollow the mountain wind moved through the trees with its usual indifference. They rode for 2 more days. She learned in that time that he drank his tea without anything in it and read every morning before they broke camp, and had a habit, when he was working through a problem, of going very still in a way that other people apparently found intimidating. She did not find it intimidating. She found it legible, more legible than most people, who moved constantly and gave you nothing useful from the movement. She thought he learned things about her too, though he did not say so. He stopped offering information before she had indicated she anteed it, which suggested he had identified the way she processed in sequence. He began handing her the relevant sections of the intelligence files before she asked, which meant he was reading her enough to track what she would need next. She found she didn't mind it as much as she expected to. On the 3rd afternoon, as the mountain pass opened up and the southern foothills began to appear below them, she looked at the landscape she had not seen in 5 years, the particular shape of it, the long roll of the Ashvin Hills under their winter covering, and felt something she had no interest in examining closely. "The contact in the settlement," she said. "Will they know who I am?" "They will know you are with me," Rowan said. "That is sufficient for their purposes." She looked at the hills for another moment, then she looked at him. "You have done this before," she said. "Brought someone in from outside, someone the establishment would push back on." He considered that. Once, 7 years ago, a border dispute with the Eastern Collective that required testimony from an unregistered wolf. How did it go? He is now the registered keeper of 3 contested territories and has not spoken to me since. Kaya looked at him sidelong. "Is that a success story?" "He got what was his," Rowan said. "What he did with it afterward was his own business." She looked back at the hills. The snow was thinner here, the trees greener, the air carrying the first hint of something that was almost not winter. She had forgotten that winter ended earlier in the south. She had lived above the snowline for long enough that she had begun to think of perpetual cold as a fixed condition of the world. "I grew up there," she said. It was not a question. It was not a statement that required a response. She said it because she needed to hear herself say it before they arrived, to establish, clearly, that she knew what she was returning to and had chosen it anyway. "I know," Rowan said. They rode down out of the mountains as the light went gold and thin, the wolves running ahead through the unfamiliar landscape of somewhere she had once known the way she now knew the Grayville wilderness. By the small things, the individual trees, the specific quality of the afternoon light. It looked different than she remembered. Smaller, more manageable. She kept her journals against her side and watched the landscape change, and she did not let herself feel anything about it until she was ready. She was almost ready. Chapter 4. The shape of the deal. Rowan's contact in the southern settlement was a woman named Bria who ran a cartographic archive and apparently operated as an intelligence clearinghouse on the side with the unruffled practicality of someone who had long since stopped finding this interesting. She was perhaps 60, with ink-stained hands and a look that assessed Kaya in approximately 3 seconds and then moved on, which Kaya found deeply refreshing. They were given separate rooms on separate floors of a building that was more organized than it looked from outside, maps on every surface, files in a system that was not immediately legible, but was clearly a system, the kind of place where things were never lost because nothing was ever put down without intent. Kaya was given a workroom with actual equipment, a proper stone mortar, graduated brass measures, labeled storage jars, a drying frame already strung with cord. Someone had thought about what she would need before she arrived. She spent 6 hours in there and did not come out. She worked the way she always worked when she needed to think without admitting to herself that she was thinking, methodically, physically, her hands occupied with the reduction and preparation of the formula while the rest of her turned over the conversation from the road. The intelligence files, the 14 months, the water sources, the compound and the sediment. He had the journal before the bonding ceremony. She ground and measured and reduced and documented, and the thing she was not thinking about sat in the corner of her mind with perfect patience. He had been afraid of her. She had lived for 5 years with the shape of the rejection as an assessment, as Cadden Moore, alpha designate of Ashvin, looking at her and finding nothing worth keeping. She had built her entire wilderness life as a counterargument to that assessment, and had been, if she was honest with herself, in some ways still arguing, still working to prove, to no one in particular, that the verdict was wrong. But a verdict requires a fair evaluation. What Cadden had delivered was not an evaluation, it was a managed outcome. He had read her research. He had understood before she had understood what she was going to become. And he had arranged the bonding ceremony, the formal, witnessed, irrevocable ceremony, as the cleanest possible way to make sure she disappeared before she became it. The mortar worked. She did not notice when it stopped being necessary. She emerged from the workroom at dusk to find Rowan alone at the long table in the main room, reading the intelligence files by lamplight. He looked up when she came in. "It's complete," she said. "All 7 steps, replicable by any competent healer with standard supplies and the correct source variant." She set the document on the table beside his files. "I have included a verification key and the variant differentiation chart. Any pack healer within range of Lowland River access can source the catalyst compound themselves." He looked at the document, then at her. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" She sat down across from him without being invited to. He did not appear to require invitation, another thing she noted about him, the absence of the performance of ownership over space. "Tell me what tomorrow actually looks like," she said. "Not the summary, the mechanics." He set down the files. He had the specific quality of attention she had catalogued on the road, the stillness that other people found intimidating, and she found simply precise. The Thornwood Assembly convenes at the Central Hall in Ashvin Settlement. 15 pack representatives, 3 neutral arbiters from the Eastern Border Territories, and the Thornwood Chancellor who manages the formal record. He met her gaze directly. "Cadden Moore will be there expecting a commendation. His healers have submitted a formal claim of discovery. For the cure formula, they have been distributing under his pack's name." "Under his pack's name," she said it evenly. "Under his pack's name. The claim was submitted 3 weeks ago, which is what accelerated the timeline. If the Assembly formally records the discovery under his attribution, it becomes the legal foundation for his pack's continued control of the treatment distribution." Rowan paused. "The Southern packs are already in financial difficulty from the cost of the treatment. Attribution gives him permanent leverage. So this is about more than the cure." It was always about more than the cure. Kaya looked at the document she had placed on the table. All 7 steps, precisely notated, the compound verification methods, the variant differentiation, everything it had taken her 5 years of careful work to develop. The thing that was going to walk into a formal assembly under someone else's name if she did not go with it. "What does standing before the assembly actually require?" she said, procedurally. He understood what she was lie asking. She could see it in the slight shift of his posture, not discomfort, more like a man who was about to say a thing he had been preparing to say and was now confirming the preparation was sufficient. Under Thornwood Assembly law, a testimonial witness in a formal legacy and attribution dispute must have legal standing, must be formally recognized by a pack of record. A rogue wolf, an unregistered exile, has no standing. Any testimony she attempts can be dismissed on procedural grounds before she speaks a word. Or, she said, or presented under the direct sponsorship of an Alpha King, which grants provisional standing by decree. It cannot be challenged procedurally. The assembly must hear the testimony. A long pause. The lamp between them made the room very specific, the circle of light, the dark at the edges, the maps on the walls going in and out of visibility. Kaya looked at him. "You are going to walk me in there as yours," she said. "Not as a consultant, not as a witness, as something that implies yours." He did not flinch from the word. He did not look away. "It is the most direct legal path," he said. "The sponsorship structure requires physical presence and public declaration. It will read to everyone in that hall as what it appears to be, which is a political statement as well as a legal maneuver." "Yes. And Cadden will know it. Cadden will know it before we walk through the door." She looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him, doing it openly, without apology, the same way she read everything. Looking for the thing that didn't match, the detail that would reveal the agenda underneath the stated one. "What do you get out of this?" she said. Not the political answer, the actual one. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasively, she had learned the difference between his silences by the 3rd day on the road. This was the silence of someone who was going to tell the truth and was checking whether the words were accurate before they left. "I have run the Thornwood Alliance for 15 years, he said. "I have advisors who are competent and loyal and entirely useless for the thing I actually need, which is someone who will tell me when I am wrong. Not when they disagree with my strategy. That happens frequently and I manage it. When I am wrong, when I have missed something I should have seen, when I am about to do something that is a mistake. He looked at her steadily. I have had counselors, intelligence officers, allies, and rivals. I have never once had someone in the room who would tell me the true thing without filtering it for what I wanted to hear. Kaya looked at him. You want an honest advisor. I want to stop making avoidable mistakes, he said. The sponsorship creates a formal political relationship. What I am describing is a different offer, made separately, which you are entirely free to decline. You're making two offers, she said. The legal path and the personal offer, yes. And the personal offer requires nothing from me, except the willingness to tell you're wrong. I would not have put it as a requirement, he said, more of a hope. Kaya absorbed that. She looked at the document on the table, at the completed formula, at the 7 steps that had lived in her workroom and her isolation and her refusal for 5 years. Then she looked at him. If you are lying to me about any of this, she said, I will document it. Every conversation, every claim, every promise made in this room and on that road. I will write it down and I will publish it, and your name will mean something different in every archive on this continent. I know, he said. I'm not finished. I will do it regardless of the outcome. If you are telling the truth, the record will reflect that. If you are not, the record will reflect that instead. Either way, the record exists. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. The same controlled precursor she had seen in her cabin, the expression of a man who was surprised into sincerity and had the discipline not to show it completely. That, he said, is exactly why I told you the truth. Kaya looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up the completed formula document, folded it into her satchel with the journals, and stood. I need to sleep, she said. We should leave by dawn. Yes. She was almost to the door when he said quietly, Kaya. She stopped, did not turn around. You knew what you were becoming at 19, he said. Before he tried to stop it, you knew and you wrote it down in the snow and you went anyway. A pause. I thought you should know that I know that. She stood with her hand on the door frame for a moment. Then she went upstairs, and the lamp in the room below burned for another hour, and in the morning the wolves were ready before dawn. Chapter 5. Ashvin. She had told herself it would not feel like anything. This was the kind of thing she told herself with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned that pre-planning an emotional response was the most reliable way to prevent the response from arriving unmanaged. She had crossed the southern foothills in the early gray of the morning, the wolves spreading ahead of them through terrain she did not know but they did, and she had looked at the hills and she had thought, it will not feel like anything. It is land. It is the same land it was 5 years ago. You have spent 5 years learning other land, and this is simply a different version of the same exercise. It did not work. The smell got her first. That was the thing no amount of intellectual preparation accounted for, the particular combination of highland resin and cold river air, and the specific mineral quality of the Ashvin soil that she had not smelled since the night she walked out of it. It hit somewhere below the level of thought, in the part of her that was not made of decisions, and for approximately 4 seconds she was 19 years old and walking north, and none of what came after had happened yet. Then it passed. She breathed through it. She kept her eyes on the road and her hands steady on the reins, and she put the 4 seconds somewhere useful and moved on. The settlement was larger than she remembered, not by much, but the expansion was visible in the new buildings at the eastern edge, the additional dock structure on the river, the broader clearing around the central hall. Someone had been doing infrastructure work. She cataloged it without comment and filed it under things that might be relevant. Bria's contact in the settlement, a younger man named Pierre who had the same ink-stained hands and the same calm that suggested he had inherited the work along with the profession, met them at the edge of town before anyone saw them arrive. The logistics of the next 24 hours were delivered in low, rapid sentences while they moved. The assembly convened at mid-morning, the formal agenda had been sealed, Cadden Moore's delegation had arrived the previous afternoon, and had been seen that morning at the central hall doing what Pierre called preparatory observation, which Kaya translated as looking for potential problems and finding none. They don't know she's here, Rowan said. Not yet. Pierre glanced at Kaya with the look of someone assessing a variable. Cadden's intelligence has her dead or as good as. Nobody in his network has made contact with the Greyville territory in 3 years. They stopped looking. Good, Rowan said. Kaya said nothing. She was looking at the central hall at the end of the settlement road, a long building of dark timber and river stone, the Ashvin clan banner hanging limp in the cold morning air. She had stood in front of that building at 17, been formally introduced to the pack elders, given her first public presentation of field research on the medicinal properties of northern birch bark. The elders had been cautiously impressed. Cadden Moore had not been present. She wondered now if that had been intentional. The workroom they gave her was at the back of Pierre's building, smaller than Bria's, but better equipped, which told her that someone had made a specific decision about priorities. She set up in 20 minutes and spent the rest of the morning doing what she told herself was review, and what was actually the practice of someone who had been self-sufficient for so long that having other people handling logistics produced a low, persistent anxiety that working resolved. She read through the complete formula. She annotated the verification key. She cross-referenced the sediment documentation against the water source coordinates from the intelligence files and built a distribution map, precise and damning, on the back pages of a fresh notebook. At midday, she emerged. Rowan was at the table in the main room, alone, reading. Not the small book she had seen on the road, a different document, dense with writing, that he was going through with the focused neutrality of a man doing work he considered important but not interesting. He looked up when she came in, read her face, and set the document aside. "It's complete," she said. "All 7 steps. The variant differentiation, the verification key, the distribution map." She set the annotated formula on the table and sat down across from him. If your healers had the 4th journal as well as the 3rd, they would have had what they needed months ago. "I know. The formula is straightforward once the variant issue is resolved. The preparation is not complicated. Any pack healer with access to a lowland river source can synthesize it in 3 days from local materials." "I know," he said again. He was looking at her with that focused attention, the kind that took in more than the words. "The goal is not to confirm what you've built. Is sufficient. I already know it's sufficient. The goal is to make sure the record reflects where it came from." She looked at the formula, at her own handwriting, methodical and precise, 5 years in a single document. "He's here," she said, not a question. "Arrived yesterday. His delegation has 3 healers who have been treating plague cases, 2 legal representatives, and 4 senior pack members serving as witnesses to his discovery claim. 9 people invested in the version of events where he is the one who cured it. And you," Rowan said, "with the original research, documented in your own hand across 7 continuous journals spanning 5 years, corroborated by the pressed flower that cannot have come from anywhere except Ashvin Highland Meadows, and a distribution map that places the origin of the outbreak at water sources within documented access range of Ashvin pack territory." He was not asking her if it was enough. He was telling her what she was walking in with, the way you would lay a tool in a craftsman's hand before asking them to use it. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he said. She thought about the ceremony fire, the particular cold of that October night, her cousin stepping forward from the circle's edge. The 4 seconds this morning when the smell of this land had put her back in her own 19-year-old body before she could stop it. She thought about the entry written in the snow, the promise made to no one except herself and the North. "I have been ready for 5 years," she said. "I just didn't know what for." He looked at her for a moment, not the assessing look, not the strategic look, but the other one, the one that she had only seen a few times on the road and had not yet found the correct category for. Then he nodded once. "Get some sleep," he said. "The wolves will cover the perimeter. You won't be disturbed." She stood, gathered her journals, stopped at the door. "The small book you were reading on the road," she said. He looked up. "The one that fits in your coat pocket." "Yes." "What is it?" A brief pause. "Field notes," he said. "Mine, from the first territorial campaign, 15 years ago." He looked at the book on the table. "I read them sometimes when I am about to do something that cannot be undone, to remember what the before felt like." Kaya looked at him for a moment. "That," she said, "is a very specific habit for a man who presents as not having habits." "I have many habits," he said. "I am simply selective about which ones I demonstrate before I know someone well." She looked at him for another moment, then she went upstairs. She lay in the dark of a room in her hometown and listened to the Ashvin wind against the window. The same wind, the same rhythm, the same particular resonance that had been the background of her childhood, and she did not sleep for a very long time. But she was not afraid. That was the thing she kept returning to, checking the way you checked a compass in uncertain terrain. Not the dramatic absence of fear, not the performance of courage. Simply, the actual absence of the thing. She was awake and she was in Ashvin, and tomorrow everything she had built in 5 years of refusal was going to be asked to carry weight in public, and she was not afraid. She was ready. And there was a difference she had learned between the two. Chapter 6. The Assembly. Cadden Moore had dressed for a ceremony. Kaya saw him the moment she entered the hall, not because he was difficult to find in a crowd, but because the crowd arranged itself around him the way crowds arrange themselves around men who have spent a decade engineering that arrangement. He stood near the front of the chamber with his delegation fanned out behind him, ceremonial gray and silver, a man performing the specific relaxed confidence of someone who has confirmed in advance that the result is already decided. His healers were beside him in formal white. His legal representatives had their documents ready. He was, in every visible particular, prepared. He had not prepared for her. Hall was the largest room in Ashvin settlement. Dark timber beams and river stone walls, a long table down the center where the 15-pack representatives sat, 3 neutral arbiters from the eastern border territories at the far end, the Thornwood Chancellor at the head with the formal record book open. Lanterns on iron brackets gave the room its light, warm and amber. Kaya noted the layout, the exits, the positions of Cadden's delegation, the seat arrangements, the faces of the arbiters. She noted all of it in the 4 seconds before anyone noticed she was there. Rowan entered without announcement, which was itself a statement. The alpha pressure of an undiluted dominant wolf hit the room before anyone looked up. Chairs scraped. Counselors straightened. The room rearranged itself around him with the instinctive precision of a tide responding to the moon. Kaya walked in beside him, not behind, beside. She wore what she had worn on the road. Dark wool, worn leather, the satchel over one shoulder, her field journals stacked under her arm. No ceremony, no armor, no performance of significance. Just 5 years of documented work in the hands of the woman who had done it, walking into the room where it had always been supposed to arrive. Cadden Moore turned at the shift in the room's energy, and his gaze moved across Rowan and landed on her. The color left his face so completely, and so rapidly, that she could track the exact moment his body understood what his mind was refusing. She was real. She was here. She was not a ghost, and she was not dead, and she was walking into the Thornwood Assembly beside the Alpha King with 7 years of field journals under her arm. That's he started, then louder, she's dead, she walked north and she's dead, this woman is an imposter. His voice had the quality of a man reaching for authority he could feel slipping. The assembled representatives looked at him, then at her, then at Rowan. Rowan set the dossier on the assembly table and stepped back. 1 step, precisely far enough that every eye in the room understood without ambiguity that he was making space. Kaya stepped forward. She put her journals on the table. She straightened. She looked at the Thornwood Chancellor, at the arbiters, at the 15-pack representatives watching her with the attention of people who had just understood they were present at something that would be recorded. She did not look at Cadden Moore. "My name," she said, "is Kaya Drennan of Ashvin, daughter of Marin Drennan of the Highland Settlement, trained in Highland herbalism under healer Sova Cairn, documented researcher of northern medicinal botany for the past 7 years." She opened the 3rd journal to the inside cover and held it up. The pressed spike bloom caught the lamplight, amber and impossible. "I would like to read from my field journal, entry 41, dated the winter of my 20th year. I believe the Assembly will find it directly relevant to the discovery claim currently before this body." The Chancellor looked at the spike bloom, at the journals, at Rowan, who had said nothing and was saying nothing. "The witness is recognized under Alpha King's sponsorship," the Chancellor said. "The Assembly will hear the testimony." Cadden's head lawyer was already on his feet. The objections came rapid and overlapping. Procedural challenge, unregistered party, fabricated evidence, rogue wolf hired to destabilize the southern packs. Kaya waited. She had practiced waiting for 5 years in a wilderness that did not resolve faster because you were anxious about it. She stood with her hands resting on her journals, and she waited for the noise to finish. It took 11 minutes. The Chancellor overruled each objection in the flat, unhurried tone of a man who had prepared for exactly this. Rowan, at the side of the room, had not moved and had not spoken. When the hall had quieted enough to speak into, Kaya opened the 3rd journal to entry 41 and began to read. She read clearly and without performance. The notation was her own, the handwriting was her own, the Ashvin plant names were her own in the dialect of Highland herbalism that only someone raised in these meadows would have learned. She read the compound documentation, the toxicological testing, the careful, meticulous record of a 19-year-old who had understood what she was documenting and had been precise about every step because precision was the thing that made knowledge real. The hall was very quiet by the time she finished. She closed the third journal, set it down, picked up the fourth. She read the variant differentiation, the lowland compound documentation, the preparation method that applied to the Southern Pack's water sources. She read it in the same clear, unhurried voice, and she watched the faces of the 15-pack representatives change as they understood what they were hearing. This was not an imposter. An imposter could have forged a handwriting style. An imposter could not have forged 5 years of continuous scientific development, written in a dialect-specific notation system, cross-referenced across 7 separate volumes, corroborated by a pressed flower native to a highland meadow 40 miles from the nearest market road. She set down the fourth journal, reached into the satchel, pulled out the distribution map. Clean-lined and precise, every affected water source marked, the timeline of infection onset noted beside each one. The compound documented in entry 41 of my third journal appears in measurable concentration in the sediment samples taken from each of the 12 water sources marked on this map, she said. The timeline of infection onset at each location corresponds precisely to the known supply cycle of the Ashfin Pack's eastern trade route, the route that passes within documented access range of all 12 sources. She looked at the arbiters. I do not claim to know who carried the compound to these locations. I claim only to know who documented it, who understood its properties, and whose research was required to weaponize it. She looked at Cadden Moore for the first time since she had walked through the door. The discovery claim before this assembly attributes the cure formula to Ashfin Pack healers. That claim is incorrect. The formula originates in my third and fourth field journals. I am the author. The research is mine, and I am asking the assembly to record it correctly. The hall was completely silent. Cadden looked at the journals, at the map, at her face. Something moved behind his eyes, the expression of a man who had spent 10 years building a structure and had just watched someone remove the foundation stone with a pair of field notebooks and a dried flower. You can't prove intent, he said, quietly, the voice of someone measuring exits. I don't need to prove intent, Kaya said. I need to prove origin. The council proves intent. That is their job. She turned to face the assembly table. I have done mine. Chapter 7. The record. The noise started the moment the chancellor acknowledged the testimony. Not from the arbiters, who had the particular stillness of people doing their jobs under difficult conditions and doing them correctly. Not from the neutral representatives, who were watching the proceeding with the sharp attention of 15 wolves who had just understood that the balance of the southern territories had shifted in the last 40 minutes. The noise came from Cadden's delegation. His legal representatives, his witnesses, his healers who had been distributing treatment under a name that was not its origin, and who were now in a room with the origin sitting calmly at the assembly table with 7 field journals and a map. Identity fraud, fabricated evidence, political manipulation by the Thornwood King, a rogue wolf hired to destabilize the Southern Pack structure. The objections came rapid and overlapping, each one slightly louder than the last, with the quality of arguments not meant to persuade the room, but to fill it, to make the air too dense and contentious for clarity to breathe. Kaya waited. She had 5 years of practice at this, not at legal proceedings specifically, but at the underlying skill, the ability to sit inside a situation that wanted to move faster than you were ready for, and simply not move faster. The wilderness had taught her that the things requiring patience rewarded it, and that most apparent urgencies resolved differently if you waited long enough to see the actual shape of them. She stood at the assembly table with her hands resting on her journals, and she waited for the noise to finish. It took 11 minutes. The objections peaked, repeated themselves, began to thin at the edges as the people making them ran out of new variations. The chancellor interjected at intervals with the flat procedural authority of someone who had moderated worse than this. Rowan, at the side of the room, had not moved and had not spoken, which was its own form of pressure. The Alpha King of the Thornwood Alliance, present, silent, and entirely unbothered by the noise. When the hall had quieted enough to speak into, Kaya opened the third journal again. I'm going to read the full entry 41, she said, not loudly. She had learned that volume was the wrong tool for most situations. I ask that the arbiters and the chancellor compare the handwriting in this entry to the handwriting in the current journal I produced this morning, which I will provide as a second sample. I also ask that the notation system used throughout this entry be compared to the notation used in the other 6 journals, which are available for examination. She read entry 41 in full, every line, every notation, every marginal cross-reference. When she finished, she set the 3rd journal on the table and opened the 7th. She placed them side by side. She had been 19 when she wrote the 3rd journal and 24 when she started the 7th. The handwriting had evolved. Looser at the margins, larger letter forms, the cramped training of her childhood gradually replaced by the more natural size she had developed alone in the north. But the underlying character of it was the same in the way that a person's face is the same at 19 and 24, recognizably continuous, the changes explainable by time rather than a different hand. She watched the arbiters look at both journals simultaneously. She watched the chancellor lean forward. She watched one of the neutral pack representatives, a gray-haired woman from the western foothills whose expression had been carefully neutral throughout, stop being careful about her expression. Then she opened the 4th journal to page 27 and read the lowland variant documentation. Then from the 5th journal, then a selected passage from the 6th. Not all of it. She was not trying to bury the room. She was building a line, a clear, documented, irrefutable line of continuous development from the 19-year-old who had found a mold on a drowned river reed to the 24-year-old standing in front of the assembly with the completed cure. Cadden's lead lawyer tried twice more during the readings. Both times the chancellor shut it down before Kaya needed to pause. When she set down the 6th journal, the hall was different than it had been at the start. The quality of the silence was different. Not the silence of suppression, not the silence of noise being held back. The silence of a room that had heard something and was in the process of understanding that it could not unhear it. She laid out the distribution map. She walked through it without drama, water source by water source, infection timeline against supply route schedule, the specific sediment evidence and what it indicated. She had the intelligence files from Rowan's dossier available for every point, and she cited them clearly so the arbiters could cross-reference. She was methodical. She was. As precise, she finished. She stepped back from the table. The hall was silent for a moment that had weight to it, the particular weight of a thing that was finished and could not be undone. Cadden looked at the evidence, at the 6 journals open on the table, continuous and corroborated and entirely hers, at the distribution map with its 12 markers and damning timeline, at her face. "You can't prove I took the journal," he said. His voice was very quiet. The audience had narrowed for him. He was no longer speaking to the room. He was speaking to her because the room had already shifted and he knew it. "No," she said. "I cannot prove you took it personally. I cannot prove the chain of custody between my cabin in Grayville and the Western Market where it was sold." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need to. The chain of custody is the council's problem. My problem was establishing that the research is mine, that the formula is mine, and that the discovery claim before this assembly is incorrectly attributed." She paused. "I have done that. The council will do the rest." She turned to the chancellor. "I ask that the original discovery claim be suspended pending council investigation into the compound's origin and distribution. I ask that the cure formula be entered into the assembly record under my name and made available to all pack healers on the continent at no cost. And I ask that the formal record note that the formula was completed and authenticated by Kaya Drennan of Ashvin on the date of this proceeding." A pause. "If the assembly has further questions about the research," she said, "I am available. I have kept detailed records." She looked at the room once more. At the arbiters, the chancellor, the 15 pack representatives who would carry what they had witnessed back to 15 different territories. Then she gathered her journals from the table, tucked them under her arm, and stepped back. Rowan had not moved from his place at the side of the room. She walked past him to the door and stopped there, not looking at him. "Was that sufficient?" she said quietly. "More than," he said. She went out into the cold air of the settlement and stood for a moment with her journals under her arm and the Ashvin wind against her face, and she breathed. She had spent 5 years making herself into the most complete version of what she had promised herself she would become. She had walked back into the place that erased her, and she had stood in front of everything it had built on her silence, and she had spoken clearly, without apology, in her own voice. The record existed now. It could not be revised. That was enough. Chapter 8. Challen. She heard Cadden's voice through the hall door before she had walked 10 feet from it. Legacy challenge. 2 words, loud enough to carry. The specific volume of a man who needed the room to hear him make the move before anyone could stop him. Kaya stopped walking. She knew the law. She had grown up in Ashvin, raised on the pack codes the way Highland children were raised on them, embedded in the background of everything, the architecture of a world that ran on hierarchy and formal procedure. The Legacy Challenge was an old law, older than the Thornwood Assembly itself, written into Ashvin pack code in a time when physical dominance and legal standing were the same thing. When an heir's claim was disputed, either party could invoke the right to a dominance contest. The outcome was binding. It was designed for inheritance disputes between two pack members of equal standing. Cadden had just used it on a woman he had formally exiled 5 years ago, in front of an assembly that had just watched her prove his discovery claim fraudulent, because it was the only remaining move that reset the board to a version he recognized. He was banking on the world he had built, the girl with no wolf aura, no Bond spark, the ghost who smelled like the forest and nothing else, the defective Bond candidate who had walked north into the wilderness, and in the version he had told and retold until it calcified into fact, had nothing worth following her for. He had not updated his information in 5 years. She turned around and went back through the hall door. Room had shifted again, the particular charged stillness of a contained space in which something irreversible was about to happen. The pack representatives had drawn back from the table. The arbiters were consulting in low, rapid tones about procedure. Cadden stood in the center of the floor, his delegation arrayed behind him, and he looked at Kaya as she walked back in with an expression she recognized. The slight relaxation of someone who had expected resistance and found instead the outcome they wanted. He thought the formality was the hardest part. Rowan was 3 steps toward the floor before she spoke. "Mine," she said. One word, not loud. It had the quality of a single note struck clearly in a room full of noise. Rowan looked at her. She looked back at him with the full, steady attention of someone who had thought about this. Not in the last 30 seconds, but on the road south, in the workroom, in the dark of her room the previous night when sleep had not come quickly. She had not planned to be challenged, but she had understood, at some point between the snowstorm and this hall, that this was the place the road was always going. Rowan searched her face, 1 second too, then he stepped back. Cadden was already shifting before the formal acknowledgement. She could see it in the way his weight changed, the instinctive dominance posture of a wolf who had won every physical confrontation he had entered for a decade by being the largest thing in the room. He was large. He was experienced. He had held Ashvin through intimidation and force for 10 years, and he had never once in all of that time had reason to question whether force was sufficient. He charged the moment the shift completed. Kaya was not where he aimed for. She had spent 5 years in the Greyville wilderness tracking apex predators, not observing them from a distance, but tracking them, studying them, learning the mechanics of how things that were faster and stronger and better equipped than she was moved through the world. She had followed wolves for days at a time through deep snow. She had mapped the patterns of mountain cats. She had learned, through methodical study and several near misses she had documented with the same precision she applied to plant compounds, that the most dangerous predators were not the strongest ones. They were the ones who knew when to move and when not to. She stepped left around the charge with the unhurried precision of someone who had made the calculation before the charge began. Cadden's momentum carried him past her. She was already repositioning, not chasing, not counterattacking, simply not being where he expected her to be. The hall watched. He came again, faster, adjusting the angle. She was not there. She read the shift in his weight before it became movement, had learned to read weight shifts on wolves in snow, in terrain where a wrong read meant the difference between the trail and the fall, and she moved with the information rather than against it. He was larger, he was stronger. In a contest of direct force, she would lose immediately and completely. That was not the contest she was fighting. She had spent 5 years alone in a wilderness that did not care about her size or her status or the verdict delivered at a bonding ceremony. She had survived it through precision and patience and the ability to understand the actual nature of a situati, on rather than the apparent one. She had learned that apex predators do not win through force. They win through timing, through the management of space, through the absolute commitment to being in the correct position at the moment that position becomes decisive. Cadden committed to a 3rd charge, and she let him commit fully. Let him extend. Let him give her the momentum. And she stepped inside it, not outside inside, into the space that opened between extension and recovery, where a very large, very fast animal is briefly nowhere and everywhere at once. And she hit him low and hard and right, using his own momentum the way she used the mountain terrain on the road south, as information rather than obstacle. He went down. The room made no sound. She was at his throat before he had completed the fall. Her jaws at the line of his neck, the formal position, the exact placement the old law required. She could feel his pulse against her. Fast, the pulse of a large predator who has just discovered that the thing he was hunting had been tracking him the entire time. She held the position for 3 full seconds. Then she released him and shifted back. Her breathing was steady. Her hands, when she looked at them, were still. She had been in the state of controlled focus since she walked back through the hall door, and she was still in it. That was good. Cadden was on his feet. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in the bonding ceremony, not in the hall tonight. She had seen contempt and calculation and the specific performing confidence of a man who had never lost. This was something different. This was a man looking at a version of a person he had believed he understood and finding that his entire model was wrong. She had been prepared for him to be afraid of her at 19. She had spent 5 years not being prepared for what it would feel like to see it. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. Her voice was level. "I already hurt you. The moment I walked into this hall with those journals, I hurt you in the only way that will last." She turned to the assembly. "The Legacy Challenge outcome under Ashvin Pack Code is formally recorded," she said to the Chancellor. "I invoke the transfer of dispute rights." Then she looked at Cadden Moore one final time, with the complete dispassion of a researcher who has finished documenting a compound and understands exactly what it is. "I spent 5 years becoming someone you cannot read, cannot track, and cannot predict," she said. "You made that happen. I want you to know that I am aware of that." She picked up her journals. She walked out. Chapter 9. What the record shows. The hall was still in the way that things are still, after something irrevocable. Not the held breath quiet of before. The quiet of a room that has just witnessed a thing it will be describing for years and has not yet decided how. The 15-pack representatives at the table were motionless. The arbiters had stopped their consultation. Even Cadden's delegation, arrayed along the side wall, had the specific stillness of people who had been certain of the outcome 20 minutes ago and were now doing the arithmetic on what the new outcome meant for them personally. Kaya had walked back through the door because she was not finished. She stood in front of the assembly table, and she was not shaking, and her voice, when she opened it, was the same voice it had been for the past 2 hours. Clear, unhurried, the voice of someone who understood that precision was the only instrument that mattered. "He is to be stripped of pack leadership," she said. "The Legacy Challenge outcome under Ashvin Pack Code requires submission of the challenged party and transfer of dispute rights to the victor. I am invoking that transfer." She looked at the Chancellor. "I am not claiming Ashvin Pack leadership. I am remanding it to the Interpack Judicial Council pending the formal investigation into the poisoning charges." The Chancellor's pen had not stopped moving since Cadden went down. "His name goes into the historical record," she continued, "not as the healer who cured the Southern Plague, as the alpha who manufactured it using stolen research and distributed fraudulent treatment to financially exploit Pack territories in crisis." She paused. "I ask the Assembly to ensure that distinction is clear in the formal record and permanent in the archive." Cadden made a sound behind her. Not words, something more fundamental. The sound of a man who had constructed an identity over 10 years and had just watched it collapse into something smaller and uglier than the truth would have been. She did not look at him. "The cure formula goes into public record under my name, Kaya Drennan of Ashvin, available to every pack healer on the continent, free of distribution restriction, this date forward." She looked at the arbiters. "I ask that the public record include attribution language that cannot be amended, modified, or appended without the formal consent of the original author. The formula is a gift to the packs. It is not a political asset. It will not become one." She reached into the satchel, pulled out the completed formula document. She had made 3 copies the previous morning, with the foresight of someone who understood that original documents in contested proceedings had a tendency to become unavailable. She placed 1 copy before the Chancellor, 1 before the Chief Arbiter, and kept the 3rd. "The Southern packs that have been paying for treatment under Cadden Moore's distribution system should be refunded," she said. "I understand the Council's jurisdiction over financial restitution is limited, but I ask that the formal record note the recommendation clearly." She looked at the pack representatives, all 15 of them, one at a time. "The treatment they were paying for is available to them now for nothing. I would like them to know that." She turned around. Cadden was standing. He looked smaller than he had looked at the start of the proceeding. Not physically, but in the way presence fills a room he had diminished. The ceremonial gray and silver looked like costume now. His delegation had shifted slightly away from him in the small, instinctive way of people revising their associations. She looked at him the way she had looked at the mold on the drowned River Reed, with the focused attention of a researcher identifying a compound, understanding its properties, and deciding what it was useful for. "You wanted credit for my work," she said. "You wanted to stand where I am standing and have the room look at you the way they are going to look at me in the archive for the next 200 years. She held his gaze. "Instead, your name is in the record as the man who poisoned the Southern Pax, and mine is the name attached to the thing that healed them. You will be a footnote in the history of something good, and that is the most your name is going to mean from this day forward." She picked up her journals from the table. She tucked the satchel's strap over her shoulder. "I'm done," she said to the Chancellor. "If the Council has questions, Rowan Asheville's people can direct them to me. I will be available for 30 days before I return north." She walked out. The cold of the settlement hit her like the first breath after a long hold. Sharp, clean, real. She stood on the step outside the hall and looked at the sky, which had gone the pale gray of late afternoon. The wolves were stationed at intervals around the perimeter of the settlement, visible at the edges of her vision. Slate was nearest, resting at the corner of the building to her left, and he looked at her with his gold eyes and did not move. She sat down on the step. She was not shaking. She had been expecting to shake, had noted it as a likely physiological response, and had prepared to manage it. But her hands were steady and her breathing was even, and she felt, primarily, tired. Not the bad tired. Not the tired of something wrong. The tired of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and having finally set it down. The hall door opened behind her. She did not need to turn around. Rowan sat down beside her on the step, not so close that it required acknowledgement, but close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of him in the cold air. He did not say anything. She appreciated that. They sat for a while in the cold, the settlement going about its early evening business around them, the sky considering snow. "I forgot what it felt like," she said finally, "to do something in front of people." He was quiet for a moment. "What did it feel like?" She thought about it. "Like being 19 and handing my first field research to the pack elders, before it went wrong, when I still thought the work was the whole point." "It is the whole point," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, the expression she had catalogued on the road. Not quite a smile, not calculation, something more interior than either. The face of a man thinking something he was not going to say yet. "The formal record will be complete by tomorrow morning," he said. "The arbiters will begin the council referral by week's end. The financial restitution recommendation will be in the formal minutes." A pause. "You did everything you came to do." "Yes." "And 4 of your conditions are fulfilled." "Yes." Another pause. The cold was comfortable now. She had spent enough winters in the north that she had stopped finding cold uncomfortable and started finding it normal. The Asheville cold was different from the Grayville cold. Warmer, slightly, less serious about itself. She had missed that, she realized, without knowing she had missed it. "Silt has been eating Harwick's rations," Rowan said. Kaya almost smiled. "He does that. He has terrible boundaries about food." "Harwick doesn't seem to mind." "Harwick is going to be very difficult to explain to him when we go north." She stopped, registered what she had just said. "When I go north." The correction sat between them, with the precision of something that had accidentally told the truth. Rowan did not point it out. He looked at the sky, and she looked at her hands, and the settlement made its evening sounds around them, and the snow, when it started, came down with the quiet persistence of something that intended to stay. She sat in it for a long time, not because she did not know where the warmth was, because she was, for the first time in 5 years, in no particular hurry. Chapter 10. What stays open? 3 days after the assembly, Kaya's name was formally restored. It was entered into the Thornwood archive with the full Asheville lineage. Kaya Drennan of the Highland Settlement, daughter of Marin Drennan, granddaughter of Sova Cairn the Elder Healer, whose name appeared in the foundational records of the Asheville Pack's medical tradition. The archivist found the original entry without being asked, and added the cross-reference himself. A man of perhaps 50 with ink on both elbows who had been working in this archive for 20 years, and apparently found genuine satisfaction in the correction of errors. The stolen Asheville land rights were returned. The Highland meadow plots that had been reassigned to Cadden Moore's family holdings when the pack formally recorded her as absent and defaulted were returned. Not to her pack standing, which no longer existed and which she had not requested. To her directly, registered under individual title, the first individual non-alpha land title recorded in Ashvin in 40 years. The cure formula was distributed to every pack healer network in the Thornwood Alliance within 48 hours, then to the Eastern Collective, then, through Rowan's diplomatic channels, to the border territories and the independent settlements. A week after the assembly, the formula existed in 12 separate archives in 8 different territories, each entry noting the author. It was already being copied. The Southern Pax sent a formal letter of gratitude addressed to Kaya Drennan of Ashvin. She read it once, put it in the 4th Journal's inner cover, and did not take it out again. She would read it more carefully later, when she had had time to decide how to hold it. Cadden Moore was remanded to the Interpac Judicial Council on 7 counts including deliberate contamination of PAC water sources, fraudulent attribution of medical research, and financial exploitation of sick PACs during a manufactured crisis. She did not attend the remand proceedings. She was not required to, and she did not want to. She had done what she came to do. The council could do the rest. On the 4th evening after the assembly, she sat alone in the workroom at Pier's building with the door closed and her journals open around her and her hands, for the first time in days, perfectly still. She was thinking about Grayville. Not with longing exactly, or not only. She was thinking about it the way she thought about the compound documentation, by going through it carefully, cataloging the actual contents rather than the expected ones. The cabin, the drying loft, the garden that would need new silverroot beds in the spring, the traps that needed resetting. Silt's food, stored in the reinforced alcove, sufficient for 3 weeks if she was careful about calibrating his portions, which she was never careful about because he had a way of looking at her that she found structurally difficult to refuse. Silt was currently asleep in the main room on a blanket that had not been there before she had taken him to Harwick's care. Someone had given him a blanket. She had not asked who. She was also thinking, with more difficulty, about the other thing. She had spent 5 years building a world in which the only variables were the ones she could manage. The North had been her terms, her cabin, her research, her silence, her choice. She had not realized, until the smell of Ashvin hit her coming over the pass, how much of what she had built was an answer to something. How much of the solitude was a counterargument rather than a preference. How much of I Need Nothing had been the only story that worked for a long time rather than the true one. She needed things. She had always needed things. She had simply stopped naming them because unnamed things were easier to live without. The workroom door opened. She did not look up. She knew his footsteps by now. The particular weight distribution of a very tall man who had learned to move quietly, the small pause before he entered any room that she had come to understand, was not hesitation, but consideration. He came in and sat down across from her table without being invited to, which he had stopped waiting to be invited to on the 2nd day of the road south, and she had not corrected it. They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who had run out of tasks to hide behind. It had a different quality than their silences on the road. Those had been full of things being filed and sorted, both of them doing the work of learning the shape of the other person with the careful attention of people who lived by accurate information. This silence was finished with that work. It had the specific weight of 2 people who understood each other and were waiting for the understanding to become something. The conditions I named, Kaya said finally, before we left. Yes. You agreed to all 4. I did. The 4th condition was that, when the assembly proceedings were concluded, I retain the unconditional right to return north without obligation, expectation, or formal tie to any PAC structure. Yes, he said. His voice was steady. He did not qualify it or preempt what was coming. I am telling you that I know that, she said. That I know the condition stands, that you will not, that I am not going to walk out of this room and find that something has changed in how it was recorded or what it means. Nothing has changed, he said. The condition stands. She looked at her hands, ink-stained as always, scarred on the right knuckle from a mishandled drying knife in her 2nd winter, on the left palm from the river crossing she had documented in a footnote of the 4th Journal as an example of the kind of miscalculation that cold water and poor preparation could produce. Perpetually competent. The hands of a woman who had built everything herself and had, for a long time, considered this the only available version of herself. I have not decided yet, she said. I know. I have not decided whether I want to go back immediately or stay through the spring to oversee the formula's distribution, whether I want to go back at all as a primary address or whether she stopped. The sentence had gone further than she had planned for it to go. She looked at the table. I have not decided. The workroom is yours as long as you want it, he said. There is no timeline. There's always a timeline. Not when I am imposing. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression she had finally found the correct category for some time around the third day on the road. The expression was simply attention. The complete unmanaged attention of someone who found you genuinely interesting and had decided not to perform indifference about it. She found she was tired of performing indifference too. The personal offer, she said. The one you made separately from the legal arrangement, the advisor. Yes. I want to revise the terms. A pause, not the pause of surprise, the pause of someone listening carefully. Tell me. I won't be a counsel position, she said. I won't have a title or a formal role in the alliance structure. I won't be asked to attend proceedings in an official capacity or to provide testimony on demand or to function as anything that sounds administrative. She looked at him. But I will tell you when you are wrong. I will do it regardless of whether you want to hear it, and I will document everything, and the record will exist whether or not it is ever needed. Those are my terms, he said, exactly as I offered them. I'm not finished. He waited. Exchange, she said. I want access to the Thornwood Archive's botanical records, which predate my research by 200 years and contain documentation of northern plant variants I have not had access to. I want correspondence access to the 3 independent Highland healers in your eastern territories who are doing work I have been aware of from trader reports for 4 years and have not been able to reach. And I want, she stopped, started again. I want the 4th condition modified. The room was very quiet. How, he said. She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked at him. The right to return north remains unconditional, she said, but I want the option, if I choose to exercise it, of returning to Ashfin afterward, not as a formal arrangement, not under any title, simply as someone who has the right to come back. He looked at her for a long moment. That right, he said carefully, was never in question. It was not something I needed to grant. You are from Ashfin. The restoration of your land title means you have the legal right to return to this territory at any time, for any duration, for the rest of your life. I know, she said. I am asking whether I have a reason to use it. Outside, one of the wolves howled. Distant, unhurried, the long note of an animal communicating across a large space that everything was steady and the night was fine. A second wolf answered it. Silt, in the next room, made the sound he made when something woke him, and he had decided it was not worth addressing. Rowan looked at her with the complete unmanaged attention that she had stopped finding alarming sometime around the 2nd day on the road, and had started finding something she did not yet have a correct word for, though she suspected she would find one eventually. She was good at finding correct words for things when she gave herself enough time. Yes, he said, you have a reason. Kaya looked at the door of the workroom. The door she had built the habit of closing, the way she had built the habit of all her walls, out of necessity and time, and the particular discipline of someone who had learned to make small spaces sufficient. She thought about what it would mean to leave it open. She thought about the spike bloom pressed inside the 3rd journal, the seeds she had carried north out of. Something she had refused to call sentimentality, the single bloom that had come up in the 3rd spring and lasted 11 days. She thought about the entry written in the snow, the promise made to no one except herself and the north. She thought about what it meant that she had written it as a promise to herself, and had kept it, completely and without compromise, in a wilderness that had never once asked her to. She looked back at Rowan. The archive access starts when, she said. Something that was not quite a smile resolved fully on his face, not the controlled precursor she had catalogued at the beginning, but the actual one, the version he had not been performing indifference about. It was a better thing than the precursor. She noted that. Tomorrow, he said, if you want. I want, she said. She did not close the door. Outside, the snow was falling in the steady, unhurried way of snow that intended to stay, and the wolves were out in it, and the archive was full of 200 years of records she had not yet read, and Silt was asleep on a blanket someone had given him, and Kaya Drennan of Ashfin sat in her workroom with her journals open around her and her hands still, and the door behind her left deliberately, precisely, entirely open. She had spent 5 years learning everything the North knew. She was ready to learn something else. If Kaya's story moved you, a woman who buried her gift so deep the world forgot it existed, who walked back into the place that erased her carrying 5 years of work, and not a single apology, share this with someone who needed to hear it.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.